Hello, this is Danielle, or Sarah Danielle Bethune, for Ohio Christian University. Um, this is my presentation on the thesis that I wrote for Integrated Seminar 2. And I will say on the outset, if I could have done anything different, it would have been starting this a lot earlier. My allotted days for doing schoolwork, most of the time I was catching up on whatever class I was in at the time, and I didn't put enough time into it. But it is a theory or a subject that I had been thinking about for probably off and on the entirety of my course here in psychology at OCU. Whenever I would be reading about different personality disorders, and we did read about all of them pretty much back to back for the first year, I would think about the people that I knew who inhabited some of the characteristics, and I think we all do that. But I also looked at it from looking at the politic and the state of the nation today, and how divided everything is and pretty much sectioned off. Nothing's really connecting. I would think of that as one big kind of a disorder of the nation, which sounds very broad, sounds very pretentious probably, but I thought it was interesting. So what I did was I went back to Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages, which is something that we looked at in the first two classes, I think, of the psychology degree. And so I looked at that, and the first stage being trust versus mistrust in infancy, and the basic virtue being hope. Stage 2, autonomy versus shame, and the basic virtue being will. 3, initiative versus guilt, basic virtue is purpose. 4, industry versus inferiority, and the basic virtue being competency. And in adolescence, ego identity versus role confusion, and the basic virtue being fidelity. Now, if you do not, as an individual, have an ego identity, if you do not navigate through whatever crisis it is in adolescence that's going to solidify who you are as a person, then the next 3 stages are going to be negative or positive. And the next 3 stages is intimacy versus isolation. And if you don't know who you are, you can't have meaningful relationships, or you'll be isolated. And the 7, you have generativity versus stagnation, and the basic virtue is care. The 8th is ego integrity versus despair. Now, all of these spawn from, on the 5th stage, if you're not able to identify yourself or have a definitive identity, you're going to have these kinds of problems in relationships, in whether or not you are happy, or you're going to have despair, or you're going to, all of these qualities of life, they're going to be there or not. And Erik Erikson actually stated that if you are not able to navigate the crisis on the 5th stage and have an identity, you will either become isolated and disappear, or you will adopt a negative identity and reject the dominant values of your upbringing, which is basically what we probably call being rebellious, but it's a rejection of all of those things and a taking on of a negative identity. So, looking at those stages, I thought of America as a nation. When we did start off, we was the hope of making our own nation, right? and becoming autonomous or independent from Britain. Then we had the third virtue is purpose, industry versus inferiority, being competent. We are an industrial nation, and we have been, we've become an empire, but some people now say that empire is falling. Well, why? In the fifth stage, ego identity versus role confusion, where did we go wrong in identifying ourselves? We used to identify ourselves as a Christian nation. So what happened? We don't really identify ourselves that way anymore. There's Christians here that will identify ourselves as Christian, identify our nation as Christian. But then on the other extreme, people that don't say that anymore, reject vehemently. People in authority here in America reject that vehemently. So what does it all mean? Because if you have an identity crisis and it's not navigated, you're going to end up with an identity disorder. So I looked at the different identity disorders, and one that is prevalent here in the country, or seems to be, its traits, I'll say that, and I won't say that there's a lot of narcissistic diagnosed people, but there are a lot of narcissistic traits in the people here in America, or especially the young people. And this has been researched by different psychologists or different researchers, and just the attitudes, the public attitudes of people who are younger than me, of narcissistic personality disorders. The traits are there on a spectrum of just mere selfishness and mindlessness to very mean, very aggressive behaviors that exhibit a lack of empathy, such as killing animals or children killing each other, these kinds of evil things. And it is theorized that narcissism stems from a trauma in childhood. This doesn't mean that the person had to be abused and they became an abuser. It doesn't mean that they were even neglected. They could have been overprotected or showered with everything they could ever want and never had to want for anything, so they feel a sense of entitlement. On the other end of it, if they were abused or they constantly had to work for attention, affection, then they also feel a sense of entitlement. But there is the theory that a trauma could have happened that just caused them to stop developing as a young adult, and if they stopped developing or they weren't able to get past that traumatic event, whether it was something that hurt their psyche or that hurt their spirit and they weren't able to navigate it, things could have been going great in their life, and then maybe they were something private and abusive could have happened that was covered up, and when things are covered up, they generally rule our lives. So there's that thought, and I'll just, for lack of time, I'll leave it at that particular disorder that I did look at, since America has become so narcissistic and almost bipolar as well in its extremes of politics and in the way that they hop on various bandwagons week to week, these kinds of things. So we went back to our beginning and our inception and the different traumas that had happened, and I did look at a lot of native writers, native intellectual speakers who do say in their communities these kinds of traumas still exist, and people are still healing from them. So what does that mean for the white America who might have caused those traumas? Do we have guilt that is unresolved? And the trauma works both ways. Anyway, we have lost we don't have an identity anymore, so we're in an identity crisis. Thank you.